Welcome everyone to another live session from the Kigali Global Dialogue. I'm Ritika Passi from ORF, and ORF, in collaboration with an African partner think tank, the OCP Policy Center in Rabat, recently published a volume of collected chapters on India-Africa engagement. The objective was to bring together Indian and African contributors who could talk from an individual perspective on issues of common interest and provide concrete policy suggestions on improving local agency, as well as strengthening cooperation between India and Africa on these issues. I have with me Dr. Miriam Omolo, one of the contributors of this publication. Dr. Omolo is from the African Policy Research Institute in Kenya. An economist, she has contributed a chapter on an African perspective on the role that the African private sector plays in India-Africa economic ties. Welcome, Dr. Omolo.
Thank you.
So my first question to you is, there is a target of achieving $500 billion of trade between India and African countries by 2020. How viable is this, do you think, given the current trade levels between the two regions?
I think it's very ambitious because currently what we are getting from India is around 24 billion US dollars or thereabouts. And what we are taking is around 26 billion. So if you look at total trade, we are talking around 50 billion. So 500 in 2020, 10 times, we really must improve on the content of what we are trading. But already there's a lot of imbalance because the main products we're getting from India are minerals, pharmaceuticals, which are very important because of issues of HIV and AIDS, and particularly, under the WTO, the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights issues. It's India where we can get generic drugs which are cheaper and accessible. Our products more are the raw materials. So we really have to work extra hard. We have to move from agriculture to manufacturing.
So the quality of the trade.
Quality of the trade really matters. So I think that's a bit ambitious.
All right.
10 times in
2020, yes.
Next year?
Mm-hmm.
No.
In fact, there's an estimate that it's more likely to be around $100 billion. And that clearly still seems ambitious.
The growth in trade on the average is 14%.
Yes.
So 14% of 50 total trade, I don't think even 100 billion will get there.
All right.
But it's good to have the vision.
It's good to have that vision.
Yeah.
All right. Now, in India-Africa ties, economic ties,
yeah.
There is a strong narrative about the role that the Indian industry and Indian companies have played. But we don't often talk about the African private sector. Right? So where do we situate the African private companies in the context of India-Africa trade and investment?
If I look at the architecture of the Indian or the Kenyan private companies and African private companies and how they interact with India, there's already a framework for interaction, perhaps under the summit, the India-African Forum, the summit, yes, which is largely driven by India, not Africa. And this works under the banner of the African Union. And from the analysis that I've done, a good part of those who participate are those who are politically connected. So there are those who are not in that forum or in that kind of network who tend to be left back. But at the same time, you find a good number of the private sector in Kenya or in Africa are also multinationals. So they are not Kenyan private sector per se, but India is already interacting with them at different forums because these are multinational corporations. Right. Yeah.
And I read that, in fact, as you've written, that there's actually a spike in cross-border mergers and acquisitions. Yeah. So we have African private companies that are actually investing in India through mergers and acquisitions, particularly South African companies.
Yeah.
So is that perhaps one way to take the relationship forward?
That's one way to take the relationship forward, and also you'll find because of the double taxation agreement in Mauritius, so you'll say Mauritius is doing well, and also South Africa. But again, it's because of that double taxation, and it's quite skewed. But if you look at the statistics, they almost constitute perhaps 80% of the investments. So when you're saying Africa, you're only talking 2 countries out of 54.
So
Yeah.
should the private sector be involved? Of course, there are gates.
Of course, they need to be involved, and of course, they need to be very active beyond Mauritius and South Africa. The other sub-Saharan African countries, East Africa, we have quite a number, Southern Africa, and also West Africa, Central Africa as well. But again, there's the issue of language. We assume that Africa is homogeneous. We are not. Very different in terms of culture, in how we operate. So we cannot wake up and merge. But you see, India is a very big, it's a subcontinent, but there's some element of homogeneity. I know you're very different within, but because you're a country with common policies, homogeneity is easier.
Yeah, because we're talking, of course, country
Yes.
and a continent.
Yes.
Of course, of course.
So we are talking, basically there are 2 continents, but one is very large blocks or countries. So because of that architecture, it's not going to be as easy.
It's easy.
But I think we can do better.
So on this note, my last question to you,
Yeah.
what are the policy recommendations, some of the key things that you think absolutely must happen, that governments must take a role in, that private sector companies themselves should advance, that you've advanced in your chapter?
I think the first thing is this relationship between Africa and India, and when I say Africa, is African countries, not Africa as one. The private sector should really, the African countries' private sector should really initiate that agenda, because right now it's India initiating it more than any other. The other side, or our African side, if I can say.
Right.
So they need to be more proactive and try and put politics aside, just bring in performance investments, so that what you have is what you get, what you give is what you get. Know that you're backed up by politics. It doesn't help, it doesn't work. That's the first thing. The second thing, if you look at the trade between Africa and India as a percentage of what you have in the world, it's around 10%. We can still do better. And then historically, India has been operating in Africa for a long time. And East Africa, for example, because of even the building of the railway line. So we have commonalities, we have common, maybe not common cultures per se, but we have common practices,
and
common foods, common experiences, colonization issues. We all face the same challenges. So we have a lot of commonalities in terms of culture, in terms of background, and there's opportunity to trade more, because you find that in terms of foods, what is in India is very palatable in most African countries and vice versa. Yeah, and then I think finally this is an African side issue. Deal with your infrastructure.
Right, yes.
Yeah, because if you ask me what are the priorities for Africa, if you are to work with India and get these 100 billion or 500,
Yes.
I'll give you 3. 1 is infrastructure, 2, infrastructure, and 3, infrastructure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Omolo, for joining us
Thank you very
today.
much.
To our audience, you can check out the publication on orfonline.org, and thank you for joining us for this live session.